Hi, I'm Emily. I'll be your storyteller today. Many of you use these stories to fall asleep. So before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Also, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now get comfortable. Close your eyes and let the sound of the rain guide you into the story. The city lights of Oakhaven were a glittering, rain-slick tapestry below, as I made my way to the imposing Gothic structure of the Metropolitan radio station. My shift, the solitary vigil from midnight till dawn, was a peculiar kind of peace I had grown accustomed to, a necessary balm after the recent unraveling of my personal life. Tonight, however, the wind carried an unusual chill, and the persistent drizzle felt heavier, more melancholic than usual, seeping into my bones as I approached the station's grand arched entrance. The lobby, a cavernous space of marble floors and shadowed alcoves, echoed with a profound emptiness at this late hour. My footsteps, usually a familiar, solitary rhythm, seemed to resound with an unnerving clarity, each click a small intrusion into the building's ancient, sleeping silence. The air was cool, smelling faintly of old paper, dust, and the metallic tang of complex electronics, a scent unique to this historic bastion of broadcast. It was a smell I usually found comforting, a signal of my domain. Mark, my day shift counterpart, was just leaving as I arrived, his face etched with the familiar fatigue of a long day spent wrangling sound waves. He offered a tired smile and a brief handover, the usual litany of equipment quirks and overnight schedules. "She's all yours, Livia," he said, shrugging into his coat. "The old place seems to be in one of its moods tonight, though. Lots of crackles on the line. Probably just the storm brewing." I nodded, dismissing his comment with a practiced ease. Old buildings, especially ones housing as much sensitive electronic equipment as this one, were always moody. I'd learned to filter out the groans of settling foundations, the hum of transformers, the sigh of antiquated ventilation systems. They were just part of the station's unique anachronistic charm, or so I had always told myself, a comforting backdrop to my solitary work. Once Mark had departed, his footsteps fading into the rain-swept emptiness of the street outside, I made my way to the main control room on the 3rd floor. The long, dimly lit corridors, lined with soundproofed studio doors and framed photographs of forgotten radio personalities, felt particularly desolate tonight. The usual low hum of the building's infrastructure seemed subtly different, deeper, almost like a vast sleeping lung, inhaling and exhaling in the profound quiet. My studio, Studio 3B, was my sanctuary, a cocoon of meticulously organized equipment, glowing screens, and the comforting embrace of sound-dampening panels. Here, I was the master of the airwaves, the unseen conductor of Oakhaven's nocturnal soundscape. I settled into my chair, the familiar scent of warm electronics and old coffee a welcome reassurance. The rain pattered softly against the thick, triple-glazed window, a distant, soothing rhythm. The first few hours of my shift passed uneventfully. I queued up the pre-recorded late-night jazz program, monitored the broadcast levels, ran diagnostics on the backup systems. It was a familiar dance, a series of tasks performed almost on autopilot, leaving my mind free to wander, or, as was often the case lately, to dwell on the quiet wreckage of my recent breakup. The solitude, usually a balm, tonight felt a little too profound, a little too empty. It was during a routine check of the station's security monitors that I first noticed it, or thought I did. On the screen displaying the long, deserted corridor outside Studio 2A, a flicker of movement, a shadow detaching itself from a deeper shadow, too quick, too indistinct to be sure. I leaned closer, my eyes straining. But the corridor remained, empty still, bathed in the dim, unwavering glow of the emergency lighting. A trick of the old camera, I decided, or my tired eyes. Later, while calibrating a sensitive microphone array for an early morning news feed, I heard it through my high-fidelity headphones. Amidst the usual hiss of an open channel, the faint, almost imperceptible sound of whispering voices. They were too low, too garbled to make out any distinct words, sounding more like the rustle of dry leaves or the sibilant sigh of escaping steam. Yet there was an undeniable cadence of speech, a ghostly, multi-voiced murmur. I adjusted the gain, tried to filter out the background noise, but the whispers remained elusive, a phantom signal buried deep within the static. It was probably just crosstalk from another frequency, I reasoned. Or perhaps atmospheric interference from the intensifying storm outside. Old buildings, old equipment, they were prone to such quirks. Yet, the sound had a chilling, almost intimate quality that made the hairs on the back of my neck prickle. I pushed the unsettling sensations aside, attributing them to stress and the natural suggestibility of a mind working alone in the dead of night, surrounded by the ghosts of past broadcasts. The station was an archive of voices, after all. Perhaps some were simply more reluctant to fade than others. I focused on my tasks, the familiar technical precision a welcome anchor in the growing sea of my unease. The rain outside intensified, lashing against the studio window with a sudden, violent fury. The wind howled around the corners of the old building, a mournful, almost human cry. The lights in my studio flickered once, twice, then steadied, but not before my heart had leaped into my throat. Mark's words about the old place having moods echoed in my mind with a new, unwelcome resonance. I found myself glancing more frequently at the security monitors, my ears straining for any recurrence of those phantom whispers. The empty corridors seemed darker now, the shadows deeper, more menacing. The usual comfort of my solitary routine had been subtly eroded, replaced by a creeping, unwelcome sense of vulnerability, of being not quite alone in this vast, silent building. The building itself felt different, as if it were listening, waiting. Sudden burst of static from a supposedly silent monitor speaker made me jump, a strangled gasp escaping my lips. It lasted only a second, a harsh, grating noise, then silence. But in that brief instant, I could have sworn I heard a single, chillingly clear word emerge from the electronic shriek. My name, Livia, drawn out, almost mournful, before being swallowed again by the static. My hands were trembling. This was no longer ignorable, no longer attributable to mere fatigue or faulty wiring. The shadows on the monitors, the whispers in the static, and now this. It was too specific, too personal. The building wasn't just moody, it felt aware of me. The rain hammered against the glass like angry fists, demanding entry. The long, silent corridors outside my studio door, once a symbol of my peaceful solitude, now seemed like pathways to unknown, unseen terrors. The hum of the equipment around me, usually a comforting thrum of power and potential, now felt like the purring of some great hidden beast, patiently observing its trapped prey. My shift had many hours yet to run, and the night, I sensed with a chilling certainty, was only just beginning to reveal its true, unsettling character. I thought of the old engineer's log I'd briefly glimpsed in the archive room once, its pages filled with frantic, almost illegible scrawls about voices in the wires and shadows that danced to the frequency of fear. At the time, I had dismissed it as the ramblings of an overworked, imaginative mind. Now his words felt less like fiction and more like a grim, prophetic warning, a testament to the Blackwood Station's enduring hidden life. The sense of being watched was no longer a subtle prickling on my skin. It was a palpable weight, a suffocating pressure that seemed to emanate from the very walls, from the darkened studios, from the silent, empty city that lay beyond my rain-lashed window. The night shift had always been quiet, but this was a new kind of silence, a silence that listened, that waited, that whispered my name in the static between heartbeats. The memory of my name whispered from the static, the distinct, almost intelligent quality of it, clung to me like the damp chill that permeated the ancient radio station. Hours crawled by, each tick of the control room clock a small, sharp sound in the profound, watchful silence. I tried to immerse myself in the routine tasks of the night shift, monitoring broadcasts, logging transmissions, running system checks, but a new, unwelcome layer of anxiety now coated every familiar action. The rain outside had settled into a steady, monotonous drone, a gray soundtrack to my unease. My equipment, usually a source of comfort and control, now seemed subtly alien. Levels on the mixing desk would drift almost imperceptibly, requiring constant, minute readjustments. The familiar hum of the amplifiers sometimes carried a discordant undertone, a barely audible sigh that wasn't there before. I found myself second-guessing my calibrations, questioning if the subtle distortions I perceived were real, or merely figments of my increasingly frayed nerves, a product of fatigue and the station's oppressive solitude. The whispers in the static returned, more persistent this time, less like random noise and more like an attempt at communication, however garbled and faint. They were still predominantly unintelligible, a chorus of sibilant, breathy sounds interwoven with the ceaseless hiss of open channels. Yet occasionally, a fragment would emerge with a chilling momentary clarity, a sigh, a soft, drawn-out moan, or what sounded like a single, sorrowful syllable of a forgotten word. Driven by a mixture of professional curiosity and a desperate need to rationalize these unsettling phenomena, I began to actively try and isolate these phantom sounds. Using the station's most sensitive recording equipment, I ran diagnostics on supposedly silent carrier waves, amplifying the faintest traces of signal, filtering out the ambient hum. What I captured were brief, fragmented audio snippets. The distinct sound of someone weeping softly, a sharp intake of breath, a series of clicks that almost resembled Morse code. These were not random atmospheric disturbances. They were too structured, too laden with an almost palpable sense of sorrow or distress. The thought that these might be the voices of the past, echoes of lives and emotions imprinted on the very airwaves this station had broadcast for decades, was both fascinating and deeply terrifying. The building, it seemed, was not just listening, as the old engineer's log from years ago had hinted. It was speaking, in its own fragmented, ghostly language. My duties occasionally required me to leave the relative security of the main control room and venture into the other studios or equipment rooms. These excursions, once a welcome break from routine, now filled me with a profound dread. The vast, soundproofed recording studios, designed to capture perfect silence, felt particularly oppressive, their darkness absolute, their silence so profound it seemed to press in on me, making my own heartbeat sound like a frantic drum. It was in Studio B, one of the oldest and rarely used recording spaces, that the sensation of being watched became almost unbearable. The air in there was always colder, the silence more complete, as if it were a dead zone within the already quiet building. I would feel a prickling on my skin, the distinct sensation of unseen eyes following my every move. Sometimes, I'd catch a fleeting shadow in the reflection of the thick observation window, a shape that vanished the moment I turned to confront it. I began to dread these necessary trips, my movements becoming quick, efficient, my ears straining for any sound, my eyes darting nervously into every darkened corner. The long, echoing corridors, once just pathways between tasks, now felt like gauntlets to be run, each doorway a potential source of unseen menace. The very architecture of the station, its imposing Gothic grandeur, now seemed designed to intimidate, to isolate, to trap. One night, while searching for a specific type of vintage microphone cable that Mark had mentioned, was stored somewhere in the archives, I found myself in a part of the building I rarely visited. The station's archive room was a vast, dusty chamber in the sub-basement, filled with towering metal shelves groaning under the weight of forgotten reel-to-reel tapes, vinyl records, and boxes of decaying paper records. The air was thick with the scent of mildew, old celluloid, and time itself. The room was poorly lit, a single bare bulb casting long, dancing shadows that made the rows of shelves look like the ribcage of some colossal, slumbering beast. It was a place of forgotten voices, of broadcasts that had once filled the city's airwaves, now relegated to silence and decay. As I searched for the cable amongst the clutter, my flashlight beam playing over faded labels and cobweb-draped equipment, I felt a profound sense of melancholy, of lives and stories lost to time. It was tucked away on a bottom shelf, behind a stack of warped record sleeves that I found it, not the cable I was looking for, but another book. It was a small, plain, cloth-bound volume, its cover stained and its pages brittle with age. There was no title on the spine, no author's name. It looked like a personal diary or a rough log, similar in era, perhaps, to the one I had briefly seen referenced in my earlier fleeting archival glimpse. With trembling fingers, I opened it. The handwriting inside was small, cramped and agitated, the ink faded but still legible. October 17th, 1958, the first entry I saw began. The interference is worse tonight. They are clearer now, the voices. Not just on the lines, but in the walls, in the air. Management says it's the new antenna array, picking up stray signals. I know better. This building listens. A chill traced its way down my spine. This was no station maintenance log. This was the personal record of another sound engineer, someone who had worked these same solitary night shifts decades before me. Someone who had experienced the same unsettling phenomena, the same creeping dread. His words were a stark, chilling echo of my own unspoken fears, a validation of the unreality that was slowly encroaching upon my carefully ordered world. I read on, my initial trepidation giving way to a horrified fascination. He wrote of whispers in the carrier wave, of shadows that danced just beyond the microphone's reach, of a persistent feeling of being watched, of a cold, intelligent presence that seemed to reside within the station's oldest equipment, within its very foundations. He described his attempts to isolate the source, his growing paranoia, his colleagues' dismissive concerns about his stress levels. His entries became increasingly erratic, his handwriting more agitated, his descriptions of the phenomena more vivid, more terrifying. He spoke of the station being a conduit, a thin place where the veil between worlds was almost non-existent, especially during stormy nights, when the atmospheric conditions seemed to amplify the strange energies that pulsed through the building. He mentioned a specific, unlisted frequency where the voices were strongest, a dead channel that was anything but. The final entry was short, almost illegible, dated November 3rd, 1958. "They know I'm listening," it read, the ink blotched and smeared as if written in haste, in terror. They know I understand. The static is calling my name. The building wants me to join the chorus. I have to get out, before the silence takes me too. After that, the pages were blank. There were no further entries. I closed the logbook, its brittle cover cold against my clammy hands. The unnamed engineer's terror, his desperate final words, resonated with my own growing fear with an awful, undeniable clarity. He had vanished, just like the technician in the old newspaper clipping I'd recalled seeing during my archival training. Had he escaped? Or had the silence indeed taken him, adding his voice to the chorus of whispers in the static? The archive. Room suddenly felt suffocating, the weight of its forgotten stories, its lost souls, pressing in on me. The dusty shelves seemed to lean closer, the shadows in the corners to deepen, to writhe with unseen presences. The faint scent of mildew and decay now carried a more sinister, almost funereal, undertone. I clutched the old engineer's logbook to my chest, a fragile, terrifying link to a past that was rapidly, horrifyingly, becoming my present. The knowledge I had sought, the rational explanation for the station's unsettling moods, had led me not to clarity, but to an even deeper, more terrifying mystery. The Oakhaven Metropolitan Radio Station was not just an old building filled with antiquated equipment. It was a haunted place, a conduit for unseen forces, a collector of lost voices. And I, its solitary night shift technician, was now a part of its grim, unfolding narrative. The rain outside continued its soft, mournful drumming, a lament for souls lost in the static. The dead engineer's logbook became my constant, grim companion in the long, solitary hours of the night shift. Its brittle pages, filled with a fear that mirrored my own, were both a source of terror and a strange, morbid comfort. I was not the first to hear the whispers, to feel the sentient chill of the Oakhaven Metropolitan Radio Station. The rain, a near-permanent fixture of those autumn nights, seemed to drum a ceaseless lament against the thick studio glass, a soundtrack to my deepening dread. His words about voices in the carrier wave and the building listening resonated with an awful clarity. The whispers I picked up on open channels, once dismissed as mere interference, now felt targeted, imbued with a chilling, almost personal quality. Sometimes, amidst the sibilant hisses and crackles, I would hear fragments that seemed to echo my own unspoken thoughts, my private anxieties about my stalled career, my recent painful breakup, my gnawing sense of isolation in this vast, indifferent city. It was as if the very airwaves, the invisible currents that were my stock in trade, had become a conduit for some unseen, prying intelligence. My carefully constructed professional detachment began to crumble, replaced by a growing, insidious paranoia. Were my thoughts no longer my own? Was this ancient building, with its labyrinthine corridors and shadowed studios, somehow eavesdropping on the most secret corners of my mind? Its old equipment, a sophisticated tool for psychic intrusion? The sensation of being watched, once a vague unease, now felt like a constant, oppressive weight. I found myself glancing over my shoulder even in the locked control room, half expecting to see a shadowy figure in the reflection of a darkened monitor screen. The vast, empty recording studios, with their heavy, soundproofed doors and deep, absorbing silence, became places of profound terror, their stillness no longer peaceful, but predatory, expectant. During one of my rare breaks, just before the false dawn, I stood by the tall, arched window on the station's top floor, gazing out at the rain-swept panorama of Oakhaven. The city lay sprawled below, a glittering, complex circuit board of streets and buildings, its usual vibrant energy muted by the late hour and the ceaseless downpour. But tonight, the familiar skyline seemed subtly altered, imbued with a new, menacing quality. The shadows between the towering skyscrapers seemed deeper, blacker than usual, not just absences of light, but pockets of ancient, watching darkness. The myriad pinpricks of light from distant windows, usually a comforting reminder of the sleeping city's shared humanity, now felt like countless unblinking eyes, all fixed upon me, upon this station perched high above. It was an irrational thought, born of fatigue and fear, yet I could not shake it. My gaze was drawn upwards, towards the station's massive antique antenna array, its skeletal latticework piercing the stormy, rain-heavy sky like a gnarled metallic hand. It had always been an imposing structure, a testament to the station's long history. But now, in my heightened state of paranoia, it seemed to possess a new, almost sinister significance. Was it merely a passive receiver and transmitter of radio waves or something more? Josiah Croft, the engineer from the old logbook, had written of his fear that the building listened. The antenna, I now suspected with a dawning, chilling conviction, was its primary ear, and perhaps its voice. It felt less like a piece of broadcasting equipment, and more like a vast, sensitive organ, attuned to frequencies beyond human comprehension, a focal point for the strange, unsettling energies that seemed to saturate this old, forgotten district of the city. I imagined it humming silently in the storm, not just with electricity, but with the whispers it collected, with the echoes of the city's countless untold stories, its forgotten sorrows, its hidden madnesses, and perhaps it was also a beacon, a summons, calling something from the vast, dark unknown, something that now had me, its solitary night shift listener, firmly in its sights. The thought sent a fresh wave of cold dread through my already chilled veins. Determined to find some rational explanation, some technical anomaly that could account for the increasingly personal nature of the whispers, I spent the next few hours poring over the station's oldest available schematics in the digital archive. Much of the original antenna array's design was surprisingly complex, with handwritten annotations hinting at experimental frequency modulations and resonance coils, whose purpose was not immediately clear from the faded diagrams and cryptic notes. Most of these modifications dated back to the 1950s, the same period as the old engineer's frantic logbook entries, the same period as the experimental broadcast initiative that had been so abruptly and mysteriously shut down. Was there a connection? Had those long-dead engineers, in their quest for broadcasting innovation, inadvertently tuned into something they shouldn't have, something that still lingered, imprinted on the station's very infrastructure? As I was tracing a particularly intricate circuit diagram related to the main transmission coil, a sudden, jarring power fluctuation plunged my studio into momentary darkness. The monitors died, the lights flickered violently, and a deafening burst of static, far louder and more aggressive than anything I had heard before, erupted from my headphones, making me cry out and tear them from my ears. My heart hammered against my ribs, the sudden silence that followed even more terrifying. The emergency lights flickered on, casting a dim, greenish pallor over the control room. The main power was out, but only in my section of the floor, it seemed. I could see the usual indicator lights still glowing faintly from equipment in the corridor. This wasn't a building-wide outage. It was localized, specific, as if an invisible switch had been thrown, targeting only my workspace, my sanctuary. Then, as suddenly as it had died, the power surged back, the monitors flickering to life, the ambient hum of the equipment returning. But something was different. The whispers, which had always been a faint, elusive presence in the static, were now a chorus, a multitude of voices swirling through my headphones, through the studio speakers, seemingly from the very air around me. And they were no longer just indistinct murmurs. They were clearer, closer, and filled with a chilling, focused intelligence. "Livia," one voice sighed, a sound like dry leaves skittering across stone, a voice that felt both ancient and intimately familiar. "You hear us now, don't you? You are finally listening." Another voice, higher, almost childlike, giggled. "She's afraid. We can taste her fear. It's sweet." The barrage of voices, each distinct yet part of a horrifying unified chorus, was an assault on my senses, on my sanity. I scrambled back from the console, my chair skittering across the floor, my hands clapped over my ears, though it did nothing to block the voices that now seemed to be inside my own head. They spoke of the city's secret heart, of the darkness that festered beneath its glittering facade, of the station as their chosen mouthpiece, their conduit to a world that had forgotten how to listen to the true, ancient rhythms of the night. The experience, though lasting only a few moments, left me profoundly shaken, stripped bare. This was no longer subtle. This was a direct, undeniable communication, a confirmation of my worst fears. The entity, whatever it was not just a passive echo. It was sentient, aware of me. And now, it was speaking directly to me, its voice a chorus of the city's lost souls, its forgotten sorrows, its hidden madness. When Mark arrived for the morning shift, he found me pale and trembling, the studio in disarray from my panicked attempts to shut down the equipment, to silence the voices. I tried to explain, my words tumbling out in a frantic, incoherent torrent, but his expression shifted from concern to a kind of weary pity. "Livia," he said gently, "you need to get some rest. This place, it plays tricks when you're tired. It happens to all of us on the night shift." His dismissal, however kind, was a fresh wave of despair. He didn't believe me, or perhaps he too had heard the whispers, felt the building's oppressive watchfulness, and had chosen the path of denial, of willful ignorance, as a means of survival. I was truly alone in this, with only the dead engineer's logbook as a testament to a shared, terrifying reality. As I walked home through the gray, rain-swept streets of Oakhaven that morning, the city itself felt different. Its familiar facades now imbued with a sinister, hidden meaning. The shadows in the alleyways seemed deeper, the shuttered windows of the old buildings like watching eyes. The station, my workplace, was a conduit, an amplifier. But the source, I now suspected with a chilling certainty, was the city itself. Its ancient stones saturated with centuries of unspoken, unheeded echoes, and they had found a new listener in me. The direct, chilling address from the chorus of voices had shattered any lingering hope that I was merely experiencing fatigue-induced hallucinations. The Oakhaven Metropolitan Radio Station was a conduit for something sentient, something aware of me, and the city outside its rain-lashed windows felt less like a sleeping metropolis, and more like a vast, unseen audience to my private terror. Each night shift now began with a knot of icy dread in my stomach, a reluctant return to a place that felt increasingly like a sophisticated, electronic trap. In the weeks that followed, the technical malfunctions, once subtle and easily dismissed, became more frequent, more overtly targeted. It started with small, annoying glitches. A mixing console fader that would develop a sudden, inexplicable stiffness only when my hand was upon it. A monitor screen that would fill with a burst of hissing static whenever I glanced at it for too long. A persistent, low hum on a supposedly clean audio line that would vanish the moment I tried to trace its source. These were minor irritations, the kind of gremlins one expected in an ancient building filled with equally ancient wiring and temperamental equipment. I meticulously logged each incident, troubleshooting with a methodical precision, yet I could never find a discernible, logical cause. The faults would appear and disappear with a frustrating capriciousness, often seeming to resolve themselves, just before I could pinpoint the problem, only to reoccur later, sometimes in a different piece of equipment. Then, the glitches began to take on a more unsettling, almost responsive quality. If I expressed a moment of frustration aloud, a bank of lights in the control room would flicker erratically. If I felt a surge of fear, a sudden cold draft would sweep through the hermetically sealed studio, carrying with it that faint, unplaceable scent of ozone and decay. It was as if the entity, the chorus of voices, was listening not just through the airwaves, but to my very emotional state, and responding in kind. Playback machines, usually reliable workhorses, began to skip or stutter at crucial moments. Pre-recorded station identifications would sometimes play with the announcer's voice, subtly distorted, slowed down to a guttural drawl, or sped up to a frantic chipmunk-like squeak. Once, a beloved late-night jazz program, a recording I knew intimately, played with an additional phantom instrument woven through its familiar melodies, a discordant, mournful flute that had never been part of the original arrangement. Check the source tapes, the digital files, meticulously. They were pristine, untouched. The distortions, the phantom additions, were happening in real time, during playback, within the station's own closed system. It was as if the entity was actively remixing the broadcasts, inserting its own unsettling spectral contributions into the city's nocturnal soundscape, using the station's own technology as its instrument. My hands trembled as I made notes. In the old engineer's logbook, my own entries now mirroring his descent into bewildered terror. The most terrifying of these audio manipulations occurred during the playback of a pre-recorded interview with a local historian discussing Oakhaven's lesser-known folklore, as she spoke of old, forgotten tunnels beneath the city and legends of things that whisper in the deep places. Her voice became overlaid with a chorus of genuine sibilant whispers, so clear, so close. They seemed to be emanating directly from my headphones, from inside my own head. I ripped them off, my heart pounding, but the historian's voice on the main studio monitors continued, placid and undisturbed. One night, during a particularly critical automated sequence that transitioned the station from its late-night programming to the early morning news feed, the main broadcast transmitter inexplicably failed. A cascade of warning lights lit up my console, and the airwaves, for a horrifying 3 minutes, fell utterly silent. Dead air, the ultimate sin in broadcasting. I scrambled, my fingers flying across the controls, bypassing the faulty unit, rerouting the signal, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I managed to restore the broadcast, but the incident left me deeply shaken. Such a catastrophic failure was almost unheard of. The station had multiple backup systems designed to prevent exactly this scenario. Yet they had all failed simultaneously, as if by a deliberate, intelligent act of sabotage. The timing, too, was unnerving, occurring just as I had been reading a particularly disturbing passage in the old engineer's log about the station's heartbeat and the entity's desire to control it. When Ben, my morning shift counterpart, arrived, I tried to explain the escalating series of malfunctions, the inexplicable distortions, the transmitter failure. He listened patiently, his expression a mixture of sympathy and thinly veiled skepticism. "Livia," he said gently, his voice full of a weary familiarity. "This old place is a beast. She's always got gremlins. You're working too many hours, not getting enough sleep. You're stressed. It's probably just making everything seem worse than it is." His rationalizations, however kindly meant, felt like a dismissal, a refusal to acknowledge the terrifying reality I was experiencing. It deepened my sense of isolation, of being the only one attuned to the station's true, sinister nature. He promised to have the engineers look at the transmitter, but I saw the doubt in his eyes. To him, these were just equipment failures. To me, they were acts of a focused, increasingly hostile intelligence. I tried to show him one of the distorted recordings, a segment where a newsreader's voice had been momentarily replaced by a low, guttural growl. Ben frowned, listened intently, then replayed the original clean source file. "Probably a corrupted buffer, Liv," he said, shrugging. "Or a power spike we didn't register. I'll flag it for diagnostics." He didn't hear the malice in it, the deliberate, chilling intervention that I did. The feeling of being gaslighted, not by a person, but by the very environment I inhabited, was profoundly disorienting. Was I losing my grip on reality? Was the solitude, the stress, the building's oppressive atmosphere finally fracturing my mind? I clung to the old engineer's logbook, its terrified entries a fragile validation of my own sanity. He had heard. Them too. He had understood. Then came the message. It was late, the rain a furious, relentless torrent against the studio window. I was on a supposedly secure internal messaging system, a text-based chat I occasionally used with Ben if there was a technical issue that needed immediate handover. Suddenly, a new message appeared, from an unidentifiable source. No sender ID, no timestamp. It consisted of a single, repeated sound, rendered phonetically. "Livia, listen. My blood turned to ice. It was the sound of the whispers, the sibilant hissing, but now formed into my name, into a direct, chilling command. I stared at the screen, my fingers frozen above the keyboard. This was no glitch, no corrupted file. This was a direct communication, a clear, undeniable sign that the entity was not just manipulating the audio, but the station's digital systems as well, reaching out to me through the cold, impersonal interface of my computer screen. Before I could react, before I could even breathe, the message was gone, erased as if it had never been there, leaving only the blinking cursor on an empty line. But the terror it had instilled remained, a cold, hard knot in my stomach. The station was compromised, every piece of its technology, a potential conduit for this unseen, unknown entity, and it wanted me to listen. My carefully constructed professional world, the world of sound waves and frequencies, of logical diagnostics and technical solutions, had been invaded by something that defied all reason, all explanation. The glitches in the system were not mere malfunctions. They were messages, manipulations, the playful, predatory proddings of an ancient, unseen intelligence. The rain outside seemed to fall with a new, mournful finality, each drop a tear from my lost sense of safety. Ben's skepticism, his well-meaning but ultimately unhelpful rationalizations, meant I was utterly alone in this. There was no one I could turn to No one who would believe the full, horrifying extent of what was happening within these walls, within these wires. The station, my supposed sanctuary, had become my prison. Its very technology turned against me by an entity that whispered my name in the static and glitches of its failing systems. The game had escalated. The chilling typed message, my name hissed amidst a command to listen, had shattered my last vestiges of denial. This was not stress. This was not faulty equipment behaving erratically. This was an intelligent, focused entity, and it was using the Oakhaven Metropolitan radio station as its mouthpiece, its playground. My terror, though profound, was now edged with a desperate, almost defiant need to understand. My skills as a sound technician, my intimate knowledge of frequencies and signals, were my only weapons in this unseen war. The heavy rain outside felt like a suffocating blanket. My night shifts transformed from solitary vigils into covert, high-stakes investigations. I began to meticulously document every anomaly, every flicker of static that carried those sibilant whispers, every inexplicable dip in power. I repurposed spare recording equipment, creating a dedicated listening post, my headphones a permanent fixture, as I trawled the spectrum for the source of those chilling, fragmented voices. The main control room, once my sanctuary, now felt like the command center of a besieged outpost. It took several nights of painstaking work, of sifting through layers of legitimate broadcasts, citywide interference, and the station's own internal electronic hum. But then I found it. Tucked away in a narrow, almost undetectable band, a frequency that wasn't listed on any official station schematics, was a persistent carrier wave. It was faint, almost buried beneath the noise floor, but it was undeniably there, a ghost signal, pulsing with a strange, irregular rhythm. And within that ghost signal, the whispers were clearer, more concentrated. They were still a chorus, a multitude of voices. But now I could discern individual inflections, fleeting moments of what sounded like sorrow, or fear, or a desperate, urgent pleading. It was as if this hidden frequency was a direct line to an ocean of lost voices, a forgotten channel teeming with spectral transmissions. The rain against the window seemed to hum in sympathy with its unsettling cadence. The signal was strongest, I discovered, during the heaviest downpours, when the atmosphere was thick with electrical charge. It was as if the storm itself acted as an amplifier, or perhaps the entity, whatever it was, used the conductive pathways of the rain-soaked city and the station's massive antenna array to boost its ethereal broadcasts. The old engineer's logbook had mentioned the building listening. Now I knew it was also transmitting, or at least resonating with this hidden, haunted frequency. My next step was to delve into the station's physical archives again, that vast, dusty repository of forgotten history in the sub-basement, searching for any mention of this unlisted frequency, any clue to its origin. The memory of the old engineer's terrified final entry was a cold weight in my gut, but I knew the answers, if they existed, lay buried in the station's past, amongst the decaying tapes and forgotten documents. Armed with a powerful flashlight and a growing sense of dread, I navigated the labyrinthine shelves, the air thick with the scent of mildew and decaying celluloid. The silence here was different from the control room's electronic hum. It was a dead, tomb-like quiet, broken only by the drip of water from a leaking pipe and the frantic beating of my own heart. Each shadow seemed to writhe with unseen presences, each rustle of old paper a potential threat. It was in a battered, cardboard box tucked away in the darkest, most remote corner of the archive that I found them. a series of brittle, architectural schematics and engineering notes, all dating back to the early 1950s, all stamped with the ominous project title, Project Nightingale, Experimental Resonance Initiative. The very name sent a shiver down my spine. This was undoubtedly connected to the old engineer's descent into madness. The schematics detailed modifications to the station's primary antenna array and the installation of specialized receiving equipment in the sub-basement, equipment that was not on any current inventory lists. The accompanying notes spoke of attempts to capture and amplify telluric currents and explore subliminal acoustic phenomena, using the station itself as a giant experimental resonator. The language was technical, academic, yet underscored by a chilling, almost obsessive fervor. Then I found the tapes. A small, unassuming stack of reel-to-reel audio tapes, their labels faded and handwritten. Nightingale Test Broadcast, Delta Wave, Echolocation Trial, Subharmonic, and, most chillingly, Session 7, Contact? My hands trembled as I realized what I was holding. Recordings from the very experiments that had terrified the old engineer, perhaps even recordings of the entity itself. Back in the relative safety of my control room, the rain still lashing, the windows, I carefully threaded the first tape, Nightingale Test Broadcast, onto an old, lovingly maintained reel-to-reel machine I sometimes used for archival audio restoration. The tape hissed and crackled as it began to play, the sound quality poor, degraded by time and neglect. Then, through the noise, came a series of low, pulsing hums, frequencies that made my teeth ache. Suddenly, the hum was overlaid with a chorus of faint, sibilant whispers, identical to those I had been tracking on the ghost frequency. They grew louder, more insistent. And then, a man's voice, calm and academic at first, began to speak. Test log, October 17th, 1958. Dr. Alistair Thorne. Presiding. We are attempting to isolate the anomalous carrier wave. A distinct rhythmic signature noted, almost like breathing. The voice on the tape began to falter, to fill with a dawning unease. The signal is responding, Dr. Thorne continued, his voice now strained. It's adapting to our probe. The whispers, they're forming words. No, not words. Something else. A pressure, a presence. His breath became ragged, and then a sound that made my blood run cold. A low, guttural, inhuman growl, followed by a sharp cry of terror, and the abrupt, jarring sound of the recording cutting off. I ripped the headphones from my ears, my heart pounding, my skin clammy with cold sweat. Dr. Alistair Thorne. The name from countless academic papers on early broadcast theory I'd studied in college. He had been a pioneer, a visionary, and he had been here, in this station, conducting these terrifying experiments, and he had heard it too. The whispers, the presence, the inhuman growl. What had happened to him? The implications were horrifying. The phenomena I was experiencing were not new, not accidental. They were a direct consequence of these forgotten experiments, a deliberate attempt to contact, or perhaps to awaken, something that should have been left undisturbed. The station wasn't just a passive conduit. It was a purpose-built instrument, designed to tune into the very frequencies of unease I was now battling. The ghost signal, I now realized with a chilling certainty, was not just interference. It was an open line, a channel deliberately pried, opened decades ago and never properly closed. And the entity on the other end, awakened or perhaps even angered by those old experiments, was still there, still listening, still whispering, still waiting. The rain outside seemed to carry its patient, ancient voice. I looked at the remaining tapes, particularly the one labeled Session 7, Contact, with a mixture of terror and a desperate, almost morbid curiosity. They held answers I knew. Perhaps even the key to understanding the true nature of the entity, and the fate of Dr. Thorne and the terrified engineer whose logbook I now possessed. But listening to them felt like opening a door to a darkness from which there might be no return. The station around me, once a place of solitary work, now felt like a mausoleum, haunted by the ghosts of failed experiments and the echoes of voices, long silenced. The heavy rain continued its relentless assault, each drop a tiny hammer against the fragile barrier of my sanity. The ghost signal thrummed in the airwaves, a constant, insidious whisper, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that it was calling to me, inviting me to listen more closely. The horrifying abruptness of Dr. Alistair Thorne's final recorded words, the inhuman growl that had followed, echoed in my mind long after I had ripped the headphones from my ears. The ghost frequency, the unlisted band I had discovered, was not merely a repository of faint whispers. It was a conduit for something that had terrified, and perhaps consumed, a brilliant scientist decades ago. My own investigation into the station's anomalies had crossed a threshold into something far more dangerous than I could have imagined. The rain outside fell with a renewed, chilling persistence. Sleep was impossible. My small apartment offered no refuge from the thoughts that plagued me. The old engineer's log, Dr. Thorne's terror-filled tape. These were not isolated incidents. They were pieces of a larger, more sinister puzzle, and I felt an almost obsessive compulsion to find more, to understand the true extent of the darkness that festered within the Oak Haven metropolitan radio station. The next night, armed with a heavy flashlight and a grim determination, I descended once more into the station's sub-basement archives. The air in the archive room was colder than before, the silence heavier, more watchful. I focused my search on personnel records from the 1950s, hoping to find more information on Dr. Thorne, on the unnamed engineer from the first logbook, or on any other staff members who might have been involved with Project Nightingale. The meticulously kept employment files, however, were strangely devoid of detail when it came to that specific period. Many simply marked transferred or resigned, no forwarding address. Then, tucked away in a box of miscellaneous station correspondence, I found it. A small, yellowed newspaper clipping from a 1959 edition of the Oak Haven Chronicle. The headline read, "Local radio engineer vanishes without trace. Police baffled." The article detailed the disappearance of one Mr. Arthur Penwright, a sound engineer at the station, last seen working late on an undisclosed research project. His colleagues reported he had been agitated, obsessed with strange broadcast interference. My blood ran cold. Penwright was the name signed in the first logbook I'd found. The official report concluded with no evidence of foul play, but the article hinted at darker rumors, at local whispers of the radio station being unlucky or even cursed. Penwright was not the first employee to vanish suddenly, nor, the article chillingly implied, would he likely be the last. The station, it seemed, had a history of consuming those who delved too deeply into its electronic mysteries, those who listened too closely to its hidden frequencies. Further searching unearthed a box of old listener complaint forms from the same era. Dozens of letters penned in faded ink detailed strange experiences, voices whispering through their radios late at night, eerie music seeming to emanate from silent channels, children waking from nightmares, babbling about the man in the static. All these complaints had been dismissed by station management at the time as atmospheric conditions or overactive imaginations. But I knew better. These were not isolated incidents of public fancy. They were corroborating evidence, echoes, of the same phenomena that Penwright and Thorne had encountered, the same that were now tormenting me. The station hadn't just been listening. It had been broadcasting its unease, its captured sorrows, out into the unsuspecting city for decades, a subtle, insidious infection on the airwaves. My flashlight beam fell upon a series of bound internal memos regarding Project Nightingale. Most were heavily redacted, dense with technical jargon, but one, less guarded, spoke of the unforeseen amplification of ambient psychic resonance and the destabilizing effect on sensitive personnel. It recommended the immediate cessation of all experiments on the subharmonic frequency band and the decommissioning and sealing of Sub-Level B research facilities. Sub-Level B, the sub-basement. The schematics I had found earlier, detailing modifications to the antenna and strange receiving equipment, all pointed to this deeper, forgotten level of the station. This was where Project Nightingale had taken place, where Thorne had met his terrifying end, where Penwright had lost his sanity. This was the source, the heart of the ghost signal, the dead frequency that was anything but. A profound connection formed in my mind, a chilling empathy for these men, these fellow technicians who had trod this same path of discovery and dread decades before me. They too had heard the whispers, felt the watching presence, and had tried to understand, to rationalize, only to be dismissed, to vanish, or to be driven mad. Their warnings, unheeded, were now my only guide. As I was sifting through a pile of scorched blueprints clearly related to the sub-basement equipment, a soft cough made me jump violently. I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting through the dusty air to see Mr. Henderson, the elderly night security guard, standing in the doorway. His face, usually placid, was etched with a deep concern, his eyes wide with a fear I recognized. "All too well, Miss Livia," he said, his voice a low, trembling whisper. "You shouldn't be down here, not with these old things." He gestured vaguely at the boxes of records, his hand shaking. "Some doors are best left closed, some echoes best left unheard. This place, it remembers too much." His sudden appearance, his uncharacteristic display of emotion, was deeply unsettling. "Mr. Henderson," I began, "what do you know about Project Nightingale? About what happened in the sub-basement?" His face paled. "Nothing, miss," he stammered, backing away slightly. "Nothing good. Old stories. Sad stories. Best forgotten. The station. It doesn't like to be reminded of those times. It gets agitated." His fear was palpable, a raw, almost childlike terror. He had clearly seen or heard things during his long years patrolling these silent, empty corridors at night. He knew more than he was letting on, but he was too terrified to speak it aloud. His warning, however vague, was a potent confirmation. The sub-basement was not just a forgotten storage area. It was a place of active malevolence, a wound in the station's fabric that had never truly healed. Just then, a low hum began to emanate from the floor beneath our feet, a deep, resonant thrumming that vibrated up through the concrete. The single, bare bulb hanging from the ceiling flickered violently, then extinguished, plunging us into near darkness. Mr. Henderson let out a small, choked cry. "It knows," he whispered, his voice filled with an unutterable dread. It knows you're down. Here. It's listening. The whispers started then, not from my headphones this time, but from the very air around us. A chorus of sibilant, angry voices swirling through the dusty archive room, seeming to rise from the sub-basement below. They were clearer, more menacing than ever before, filled with a possessive, territorial fury. And among them, I could distinctly hear the inhuman growl that had ended Dr. Thorne's final recording. Mr. Henderson grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "We have to go, miss. Now, before it takes notice of you properly." He was already pulling me towards the door, his earlier reticence replaced by a desperate urgency. The floor vibrated more intensely, and the scent of ozone and something else, something ancient and metallic, filled the air, making it difficult to breathe. As we stumbled out of the archive room and back into the main basement corridor, I found, clutched in my hand, a single scorched page that must have fallen from the Project Nightingale files. It was a handwritten addendum, clearly penned by Dr. Thorne himself, his script erratic, desperate. "The frequency is not dead," it read. "It is a gateway. We didn't amplify a signal. We opened a door, and now it wants to come through. It wants listeners. It wants resonance." The final horrifying piece of the puzzle slammed into place. Project Nightingale hadn't just failed. It had succeeded in the most terrifying way imaginable. It had established a permanent connection to whatever entity lurked on that ghost frequency, an entity that fed on attention, on fear, on the very act of being heard. The vanished technicians weren't just victims, they were a prelude. Mr. Henderson shoved me towards the stairs. "Don't come back down here, miss," he pleaded, his face ashen. "Forget what you've seen. Forget what you've heard. Some knowledge. It's a curse." But I knew, with a chilling certainty, that forgetting was no longer an option. The dead frequency was an open wound, and the entity it channeled now knew my name, knew I was listening. The station, and the city it broadcast to, were in terrible, unseen danger, and the sub-basement held the key. Mr. Henderson's terrified plea to forget what I'd seen, his frantic insistence that the sub-basement and its secrets were a curse, echoed in my ears long after I had fled the archives. The scorched page from Dr. Thorne's notes, clutched in my hand, felt like a brand. It is a gateway. It wants to come through. The knowledge was a suffocating weight. My shift ended in a blur of heightened anxiety, each tick of the clock a countdown to my reluctant departure into the pre-dawn city. The rain, at least, had momentarily eased to a fine, chilling drizzle. Stepping out from the imposing Gothic archway of the Oakhaven Metropolitan radio station onto the rain-slicked streets was usually a moment of quiet relief, a transition from the building's oppressive, watchful silence to the anonymous hum of the waking city. But not tonight. Tonight, the familiar streets felt alien, imbued with a new, predatory awareness. Every darkened alleyway seemed to breathe. Every flickering streetlight cast shadows that writhed with an unnatural, sentient life. The city's usual nocturnal soundtrack. The distant wail of sirens, the rumble of early morning delivery trucks, the hiss of tires on wet asphalt, was now overlaid with another, more insidious layer of sound. As I hurried along the empty pavements, my collar pulled high against the damp chill. I began to hear it. Faint, sibilant whispers, identical to those that plagued the station's ghost frequency, seeming to emanate from the deepest shadows, from beneath storm drains, from the very air itself. My heart pounded in my chest, a frantic rhythm against the chilling, disembodied chorus. I told myself it was an auditory hallucination, my senses overwrought from the night's terrifying discoveries, the station's oppressive atmosphere clinging to me like a shroud. But the whispers were too persistent, too specific, sometimes even seeming to echo my own name, Livia. Listening, always listening. It was as if the entity, tethered to the station, could now project its voice, its awareness, out into the city, following me. Then, I began to see them, the fleeting, shadowy figures. In my peripheral vision, a flicker of movement in a darkened shop doorway, a tall, thin silhouette detaching itself from the deeper blackness of an alley, only to vanish when I turned to look directly. They were insubstantial, like smoke or distortions in the rain-swept air. Yet their presence was undeniably there, mimicking the unsettling figures I had often glimpsed on the station's security monitors. Were these actual entities, extensions of the thing that pulsed on the ghost frequency? Or was my mind, saturated with fear and the station's haunted history, now projecting these terrors onto the innocent fabric of the city? I couldn't be sure, and that uncertainty was a torment in itself. Each shadowy alcove, each unlit window, became a source of potential menace, my solitary walk home, transforming into a desperate, nerve-shredding gauntlet. The rain began to fall more heavily again. A cold, persistent downpour plastered my hair to my face and seeped into my shoes. Passing cars, their headlights cutting brief, blinding swathes through the darkness, sometimes carried with them a burst of static from their radios. And within that static, for a horrifying instant, I would hear those same sibilant whispers, a chilling confirmation that the phenomenon was not confined to my imagination, or even to the station's powerful transmitters. Reaching my apartment building, usually a moment of relief, brought no solace. The familiar lobby felt cold, unwelcoming, the shadows in its corners deeper, more watchful than usual. My small apartment, once a sanctuary from the city's clamor and the station's eerie quiet, now felt exposed, vulnerable. As I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking, I had the distinct, terrifying sensation that I had not come home alone, that something had followed me from the station, or perhaps had been waiting for me here all along. Sleep, when it finally came, was a shallow, restless affair, plagued by nightmares of swirling static, whispering voices, and shadowy figures with eyes like dying embers. I awoke exhausted, the gray morning light doing little to dispel the oppressive sense of dread that had become my constant companion. The city outside my window looked ordinary, mundane, yet I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that its ordinary facade now concealed a hidden, terrifying reality to which I was now fatally attuned. Later that day, Ben, my day shift colleague, found me staring blankly at a diagnostic screen, my coffee untouched, dark circles stark beneath my eyes. He was a kind, pragmatic man, not given to flights of fancy, but he had noticed my increasing agitation, my jumpiness, my obsessive talk of equipment malfunctions over the past few weeks. "Livia, are you okay?" he asked, his voice laced with a genuine, if slightly exasperated, concern. "You look like you haven't slept in days." I hesitated, a part of me desperate to confide, to share the terrifying burden of what I was experiencing, what I had discovered. But how could I explain it in a way that wouldn't make me sound insane? Whispers in the static? A sentient building? A vanished engineer from 1958? It was the stuff of pulp horror novels, not the rational, ordered world of a sound technician. "It's just this place, Ben," I said vaguely, gesturing around the control room. "The night shifts, the old equipment. I think it's getting to me. I've been hearing strange things, seeing things that aren't there." Ben's expression softened with sympathy, but also with a familiar, frustrating rationality. "It's a stressful job, Liv," he said, placing a comforting hand on my shoulder. "And this old station is a creaky, noisy beast. You're probably just tired. Maybe you should take a few days off, clear your head." His well-meaning words, his dismissal of my experiences as mere stress and fatigue, felt like another layer of isolation. He couldn't understand. He couldn't hear the whispers, couldn't see the shadows, couldn't feel the oppressive, intelligent watchfulness that now permeated my every waking moment, both within the station and, increasingly, beyond its walls. I was alone with this terror, with this knowledge. That night, as I sat in my living room, the city lights a distant, indifferent glitter. The feeling of being unsafe in my own home intensified. The rain had stopped, but the silence in my apartment was no longer peaceful. It was charged, expectant. My own small radio, usually tuned to a classical station, began to emit a faint, familiar hiss. The sound of the ghost frequency, the sound of the whispers. My blood ran cold. It was impossible. This radio wasn't even connected to the station's main array. It was a simple, standalone device. Yet the sibilant voices were undeniably there, faint but clear, swirling from its small speaker, calling my name. "Livia. We are here. Always here." "Listen," I unplugged it, my hands shaking, but the whispers continued, seeming to emanate now from the television, from my laptop, from every electronic device in the room. Then, I saw it. A tall, shadowy figure, identical to the ones I had glimpsed on the station's monitors and in the city's darkened alleyways, stood motionless in the deepest corner of my living room, its form barely discernible in the dim light, yet its presence an almost physical blow. It didn't move, didn't speak, simply watched me with unseen, yet intensely felt eyes. My sanctuary had been breached. There was no escape. The entity, the echoes in the static, they were not confined to the Oak Haven metropolitan radio station. It was their conduit, their amplifier, yes, but their influence, their reach, extended far beyond its ancient stone walls. They could follow me, find me, wherever I went. The city itself was their hunting ground, and I was their chosen prey, my senses now irrevocably tuned to their terrifying spectral frequency. The station, I realized with a fresh wave of despair, was not just a source of the horror. It was also, perhaps, the only place where I could confront it, where I could understand its mechanics, its purpose. Fleeing was no longer an option. My apartment was compromised. The city itself a landscape of potential dread. The only path forward, however terrifying, lay in returning to the heart of the station, to the sub-basement, to the source of the ghost signal. The old engineer's log, Dr. Thorne's final terrified words, Mr. Henderson's desperate warning, they all pointed to the same place, the same forgotten experiments, the same unleashed horror. My commute of dread had led me full circle, back to the realization that the Omen Metropolitan radio station held not just my terror, but perhaps, also, the only key to my survival, or at least to understanding the nature of the echoes that now haunted my every waking moment. The sanctuary of my apartment had been violated, the entity's chilling whispers now capable of seeping through any electronic device, its shadowy form no longer confined to the radio station's haunted corridors. There was no escape, no hiding place. My next shift at the Oak Haven Metropolitan radio station loomed not as a job, but as a reluctant return to the epicenter of the phenomena, the place where the veil between worlds felt thinnest. Fear was a constant, cold companion, but beneath it, a desperate, analytical resolve was taking hold. I had to understand the conduit, the fragmented pieces of information I had gathered, the old engineer Penwright's terrified logbook, Dr. Alistair Thorne's final, horrifying recording from Project Nightingale, the station's archived schematics detailing unusual antenna modifications, my own chilling experiences with the ghost frequency, began to coalesce into a terrifying, yet coherent theory. This wasn't just a haunting. It was a complex, ongoing interaction, and the station itself was the critical interface. The relentless rain outside seemed to drum an urgent rhythm, urging my thoughts onward. I spent hours before my shift, poring over copies of Oak Haven's oldest city plans, cross-referencing them with the station's original architectural drawings from the early 20th century. The station, I discovered, was built directly over a confluence of forgotten subterranean waterways and a network of old, sealed service tunnels that crisscrossed beneath the historic district. Penwright had mentioned the deep places listening. Thorne had theorized about telluric currents. The station's unique location suddenly seemed profoundly significant. My horrifying theory began to solidify. The Oak Haven Metropolitan radio station, with its massive antique antenna array rooted deep in the earth and its powerful broadcasting equipment housed in the sub-basement, was acting as an unintentional, or perhaps even intentionally forgotten, conduit. It wasn't generating the entity, but amplifying it, giving voice and form to a diffused, ancient consciousness, a psychic residue, perhaps, that permeated the city's oldest, darkest corners. The true echoes in the static. This entity, or collective of entities, was drawn to strong emotional or psychic energies, and the very act of broadcasting, of sending thoughts and voices out into the ether, had, over decades, created a beacon. Project Nightingale, with its reckless experiments into experimental resonance and subharmonic frequencies, hadn't just listened in. It had, as Dr. Thorne's last terrified words suggested, opened a door, strengthening the conduit, perhaps giving the entity a more direct pathway. Revisiting the scorched and redacted Project Nightingale schematics in the station's digital archive, my eyes now sharpened by this new, terrifying understanding, I found it. A small, almost overlooked annotation on a diagram detailing the sub-basement's resonance chamber and its connection to the primary antenna feed. The note, in Thorne's familiar hand, read, "Phase locked to subterranean EM fields. Caution. Potential for uncontrolled psychic amplification and signal contamination. Isolation protocols critical." This was the confirmation I needed. The undeniable link. The sub-basement equipment, the very heart of Project Nightingale, was designed to interact with these subterranean frequencies, these ambient psychic fields. It was the key, the core of the conduit. Mr. Henderson's terror, his desperate warnings about the sub-basement, now made perfect, chilling sense. He knew, or at least suspected, what lay dormant, or perhaps not so dormant, down there. My shift that night began with a new, almost unbearable tension. Every hum of the equipment, every flicker of static, every shadow in the long corridors seemed to confirm my theory. The station felt alive, a vast, intricate lung breathing in the city's unseen energies and exhaling them as whispers, as fear, as a creeping, insidious dread. The rain outside was a steady, sorrowful downpour, each drop a tiny weight on the already burdened atmosphere. I knew what I had to do, despite the primal fear that screamed at me to run, to hide, to resign and never set foot in this accursed building again. But where would I go? The entity had already proven it could reach me in my apartment. No. The only path forward, the only chance of understanding and perhaps of survival, lay in confronting the source, in descending into that sealed sub-basement lab. As I was gathering my courage and a heavy-duty flashlight from the maintenance locker, Ben, my day shift colleague, unexpectedly appeared in the control room doorway. He was early for his shift, or perhaps I had lost track of time in my fearful preoccupation. His usual cheerful demeanor was subdued, his eyes holding a new concern as he looked at my pale, drawn face. "Livia," he said, his voice unusually gentle. "You look terrible. Are you sure you're all right?" For a moment, I was tempted to confide in him, to share the full extent of my terrifying discoveries. But the memory of his earlier skepticism, his well-meaning but ultimately unhelpful rationalizations, held me back. How could I make him believe in ghost frequencies, in psychic conduits, in entities that whispered through the static? He would think I was losing my mind, and perhaps I was. "Just a rough night, Ben," I said, forcing a weak smile. "This old place, you know, plays tricks." He nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on me. "Yeah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It does that. My uncle, he worked here back in the 50s, as an engineer. He used to tell stories about the weird acoustics in the sub-basement, said it felt like the walls could hear you think." My blood ran cold. His uncle? An engineer in the 50s? Could it be Penwright? Or someone else involved, in Project Nightingale? What kind of stories?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Ben shrugged, a flicker of unease in his own eyes now. "Just old station folklore, I guess. Stuff about them trying to broadcast differently. He never liked going down there. Said it felt wrong." His words, an unintentional confirmation from an unexpected source, solidified my resolve. This wasn't just my fear, my paranoia. There was a genuine historical dread associated with that lower level. I think there's a fault in one of the backup generators downstairs." I lied, my voice surprisingly steady. "Just need to check it out before my shift officially ends." Ben looked hesitant, then nodded. "All right, Liv, but be careful down there, okay? That place gives me the creeps." He left, and I was alone once more, his unwitting warning echoing in my ears. With the heavy flashlight in one hand and Dr. Thorne's scorched note tucked into my pocket, I made my way towards the rarely used service elevator, its ancient mechanism groaning in protest as it began its slow, reluctant descent into the deepest, most forgotten levels of the Oak Haven Metropolitan radio station. The rain outside seemed to intensify, its drumming a prelude to some terrible revelation. The sub-basement corridor was colder than the archives, the air thick with the scent of damp concrete, rust, and that familiar, faint metallic tang that always accompanied the entity's strongest manifestations. My flashlight beam cut a nervous swathe through the oppressive darkness, illuminating rows of sealed, unmarked doors. According to Thorne's schematics, the resonance chamber, was at the far end. I found it, a heavy steel door, its surface pitted with corrosion, a faded, almost obliterated plaque beside it reading, Project Nightingale, Experimental. Broadcast Facility B, authorized personnel only. A newer, more ominous sign had been crudely stenciled below it in faded red paint. Condemned, do not enter. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was it. The door was not locked, but sealed with a heavy, rusted padlock that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Using a heavy wrench I'd taken from the maintenance locker, I attacked the corroded metal. After several jarring, echoing blows, the shackle snapped with a loud crack that reverberated through the silent corridor. My hands were shaking as I pulled the heavy door open, revealing a pitch-black space beyond. A wave of icy, stagnant air, thick with the scent of ozone and an almost palpable sense of ancient dormant power, washed over me. The ghost frequency, which had been a faint whisper in my headphones upstairs, was now a deafening roar in my mind, a chorus of countless voices screaming, pleading, laughing, and crying all at once. This was the conduit, the gateway, and it was overwhelmingly, terrifyingly open. Stepping inside, my flashlight beam pierced the oppressive darkness, illuminating a vast, circular chamber. In the center stood a complex array of antique, yet strangely advanced-looking electronic equipment. Massive vacuum tubes, coils of thick copper wire, strange antenna-like structures, all focused on a single, obsidian-black plinth. The equipment hummed with a barely suppressed power, and a faint, sickly green light pulsed from within its intricate workings. This was the heart of the echo. Standing in the heart of the resonance chamber, the ghost frequency and almost physical pressure against my eardrums, I felt a terrifying clarity. This was the source, the nexus point where Dr. Thorne's ambition and the station's unique architecture had torn a hole in the fabric of reality, allowing the city's ancient, sorrowful echoes to coalesce and gain a terrifying, focused voice. The air was cold, stagnant, and thrummed with a barely suppressed power. The antique equipment around the obsidian plinth its silent, waiting instruments. Outside, a distant rumble of thunder promised a new, more violent storm. The first fat drops of rain, heavy as lead, began to splatter against the high, grimy windows of the main station levels, each impact a percussive beat in the growing symphony of dread. Then, with a sudden, shocking violence, the storm broke over Oakhaven. Lightning ripped across the black sky, followed by deafening cracks of thunder that shook the very foundations of the ancient radio station. The wind rose to a furious, shrieking howl, a banshee cry against the city's stone and steel. This was no ordinary tempest. It felt charged, unnatural, as if the entity itself were drawing power from the atmosphere, its own malevolence mirrored in the storm's savage intensity. The lights within the sub-basement flickered erratically, the hum from the resonance chamber's equipment growing louder, its sickly green glow pulsing in time with the flashes of lightning. The barrier between the station's technology and the entity's raw power was visibly, audibly, beginning to fracture. The whispers, which had been a deafening chorus in my mind within the chamber, now seemed to bleed outwards, no longer confined to the ghost frequency, but seeping into every powered circuit, every speaker in the station. I could hear them echoing faintly from the corridor beyond the heavy steel door, sibilant and urgent. The shadowy forms I had glimpsed on monitors and in darkened corners now seemed to coalesce with greater ease, a deeper blackness against the storm-induced gloom, their movements more purposeful, more focused. I knew I couldn't remain in the resonance chamber. It felt like standing at the very epicenter of the entity's awakening power. Yet, the thought of navigating the station's dark, echoing corridors, now undoubtedly teeming with these intensified manifestations, filled me with a profound terror. The sub-basement, once a place of forgotten secrets, now felt like a tomb, and the storm outside was sealing me within it. The heavy steel door to the chamber, which I had pulled shut, rattled violently in its frame, not from any draft, but as if something immense were pressing against it from the other side. A low, guttural growl, the same sound that had ended Dr. Thorne's final recording, vibrated through the metal, chilling me to the marrow. The entity was aware of my presence here, at its heart, and it was no longer content to whisper from the static. My attempts to secure the station, to somehow mitigate the conduit's power, felt laughably inadequate now. I had thought to understand, perhaps even to control, but the sheer scale of the entity's energy, amplified by the raging storm, was overwhelming. If I tried to shut down the archaic equipment in the resonance chamber, I sensed it would be futile, or worse, might provoke an even more violent reaction. The station was its instrument, and the storm its conductor. The lights in the corridor outside the chamber finally gave out with a shower of sparks, plunging the sub-basement into an almost absolute darkness, relieved only by the eerie green glow from within the resonance chamber itself, and the intermittent blinding flashes of lightning that penetrated from some unseen basement window. The air grew thick, heavy, making it difficult to breathe, the metallic tang of ozone and ancient decay now almost overpowering. The shadowy manifestations in the chamber became more defined, their forms coalescing from the swirling darkness, their movements less like fleeting tricks of the eye, and more like the deliberate, inquisitive explorations of entities testing the limits of their newfound tangibility. They possessed no clear features, yet I felt their collective ancient gaze fix upon me, cold, curious, and utterly without pity. The whispers swirled around me, a vortex of sound, now tinged with a distinct, chilling amusement. Desperate, I fumbled for my phone, hoping for a miracle, a stray bar of signal that would allow me to call for help, to reach Ben, Mr. Henderson, anyone. But the screen remained blank, its battery inexplicably drained, or perhaps deliberately silenced. I was cut off, isolated not just by the storm, but by the entity's tightening grip on the station's technology, on reality itself, within these walls. It was then, amidst the terrifying chaos, that I saw it. One of the station's main security monitors, located on a dusty console just outside the resonance chamber, flickered to life. Its screen filled not with an image of the station's empty corridors, but with a swirling, nightmarish panorama of Oakhaven itself. I saw familiar streets, buildings I recognized, but they were distorted, twisted, as if viewed through a lens of madness, the shadows between them filled with writhing, unseen things. And through the static, I heard them. Not just the whispers of the station's entity, but the distant, terrified cries of the city's sleeping inhabitants, their nightmares, their anxieties, their secret sorrows, all amplified, broadcast back through the station's unwilling network. The conduit was no longer just listening to the city's psychic residue. It was feeding on it, drawing it in, its reach extending far beyond these stone walls, powered by the storm. The intelligence I had sensed before was now undeniable, a vast, ancient, and utterly alien consciousness. It was not just a collection of echoes. It was a presence, a mind. And it was using the Oakhaven Metropolitan Radio Station, my station, as its anchor, its amplifier, its voice, in a world that had forgotten its existence. The storm was its apotheosis, the moment of its greatest power, its fullest emergence. The main power to the entire station then failed with a final shuddering groan. The emergency lights, which had offered a meager illumination, flickered and died, plunging the sub-basement, the entire building, into an absolute suffocating blackness. Only the sickly green glow from the resonance chamber's antique heart pulsed in the oppressive dark, a beacon of otherworldly malevolent energy. The entity was no longer just seeping through, it was breaking through. The whispers, which had been a chorus, now began to coalesce, to merge, their sibilant hisses and sorrowful moans forming into something else, something more terrifying. A single, powerful, resonant voice, ancient and cold, yet filled with a chilling, almost playful, intelligence. It echoed not just in the air, but directly within my mind, a violation more profound than any physical touch. "You sought the echoes, little listener?" The voice boomed, its tone a mixture of amusement and immense, ageless power. "You traced the signals, you opened the door, and now you will help us broadcast. You will help us sing the true song of the city. You will be our finest instrument." The implication was horrifying. Not just to be consumed, but to be used. The barrier was gone. The storm had provided the final surge of power needed, and the entity, the collective consciousness of the city's darkest echoes, was now fully present, fully aware, its attention fixed entirely on me, its unwilling technician, its chosen conduit. The resonance chamber pulsed with an almost unbearable intensity, its green light a gaping wound in the darkness. I was alone, in the pitch black, storm-battered heart of the radio station, with an ancient, powerful entity that had just declared its intention to use me. My knowledge, my skills, the warnings from the past, they all felt like pathetic, inadequate defenses against such an overwhelming cosmic horror. The true terror of Oakhaven Metropolitan Radio Station was no longer a subtle whisper. It was a deafening, demanding roar. My shift, I realized with a chilling finality, was about to enter its most terrifying, and perhaps its last, phase. The storm raged. The entity spoke, and the city outside, oblivious, slept on, unaware of the ancient hunger that was about to be unleashed from the heart of its oldest, most forgotten conduit. And I was the only one standing in its way, or perhaps the only one left to be its voice. "You will be our finest instrument." The voice, ancient and cold, resonated not in the air, but directly within the marrow of my bones, a chilling pronouncement in the pitch-black, storm-battered heart of the resonance chamber. The sickly green glow from the antique equipment pulsed rhythmically, casting grotesque dancing shadows, illuminating the obsidian plinth at its center. My terror was absolute, a paralysis that rooted me to the spot, every nerve screaming in anticipation of an unimaginable violation. The storm outside seemed to hold its breath. The voice continued, a chorus of countless entities yet speaking as one, its tone shifting with a dizzying, nauseating fluidity. Sometimes it was a mournful whisper, filled with the accumulated sorrow of centuries of Oakhaven's forgotten griefs. Other times it was a chorus of mocking laughter, reveling in its power, in my fear. And sometimes it held a chilling, almost childlike curiosity, as if dissecting a new, interesting specimen, me. It spoke of its long slumber beneath the city, of the station acting as an unintended ear, then a deliberate amplifier. "We are the city's forgotten dreams," it sighed. A sound like wind through 1,000 broken windows. Its unvoiced fears, its buried shames, its lost loves. We are the echoes in its static, the whispers in its wires. Project Nightingale sought to give us a focused voice, and now you, little listener, will perfect that transmission. The green light from the archaic machinery pulsed brighter, and I felt a cold, probing tendril of its consciousness brush against my own mind, inquisitive and utterly alien. Then, the direct psychological torment began. It dredged up my most painful memories, replaying them with a cruel, vivid clarity. My last argument with my estranged sister, the professional failure that had led me to seek the solitude of the night shift, the gnawing loneliness I so often tried to suppress. Each memory was twisted, distorted, its edges sharpened with accusations, with self-blame, with a despair that was not entirely my own, but amplified, fed back to me by the entity. It showed me illusions in the swirling darkness of the chamber, fleeting, heartbreaking images of the life I yearned for, the peace I craved, only to snatch them away, replacing them with scenes of grotesque failure and unending solitude. It whispered insidious doubts, exploiting my deepest insecurities, my fear of mediocrity, my dread of being forgotten, of becoming another unheard echo in the vast, indifferent city. My carefully constructed mental defenses began to crumble under this relentless, targeted assault. "Why struggle, little instrument?" the voice crooned, its tone now almost seductive, a poisonous balm. "Why cling to your fleeting, insignificant individuality? We offer a greater existence, a joining with the city's true eternal song. Your sorrow will become our sorrow, your knowledge our knowledge. You will be part of something vast, something timeless. No more loneliness, Livia. No more fear. Only resonance." Its desires, I began to perceive through the haze of my terror, were not simply to be heard, but to absorb, to integrate. It was a vast, fragmented consciousness, a chorus of lost echoes, and it craved the coherence, the focused energy of individual minds to strengthen its own tenuous existence, to give its formless being a more defined voice, a more potent reach. I was not just to be a mouthpiece, but a new, vital component in its spectral machinery. I tried to fight, to barricade my mind against its insidious whispers, its terrifying visions. I recited complex audio engineering formulas, focused on the pragmatic reality of the equipment around me, clung to the memory of Ben's skeptical but kind face, Mr. Henderson's terrified warning. But the voice was too pervasive, too powerful. It was woven into the very fabric of the station, into the air I breathed, into the frantic, terrified beating of my own heart. My resistance only seemed to amuse it. "Such spirit," it chuckled. "A baby, sound like shattering glass. Such a strong, singular note. You will add a unique timbre to our chorus. Others, they were not so resilient. They faded so quickly into the song." And then it showed me. Visions, clearer now, more horrifying than any before, flooded my mind, unbidden, unbearable. I saw Dr. Alistair Thorne, his face a mask of dawning, uncomprehending terror, his brilliant mind fracturing under the assault of 1,000 whispering voices, his final moments a descent into screaming madness as the resonance chamber pulsed with its then newly awakened power. I saw Arthur Penwright, the engineer from the logbook, cowering in a corner of the archive room, scratching his desperate warnings onto a page as shadows with glowing eyes closed in around him, his spirit finally snapping, his voice joining the sibilant chorus. I saw others too, fleeting glimpses of faces, men and women from decades past, their eyes wide with the same terror that now consumed me. Their struggles, their brief moments of defiance, all ultimately futile as the station. The entity claimed them, absorbed them, adding their unique emotional signatures to its vast, sorrowful, and insatiable collective. Their spectral forms seemed to flicker at the edges of the green-lit chamber, their whispered warnings now part of the voice's tormenting symphony. This, then, was my fate. This was the end of the path that had begun with a few faint whispers in the static. There was no escape, no counter-frequency to be found, no technical solution to this overwhelming supernatural horror. The entity was too vast, too ancient, too deeply entwined with the very fabric of this place, with the city itself. My knowledge, my skills, my fragile courage, they were nothing against such a power. The last of my resistance crumbled. A profound, bone-deep weariness settled over me, a despair so complete it was almost peaceful. What was the point of fighting? An enemy that could peel back the layers of my mind, that could wear my deepest fears like a familiar coat? What was the point of clinging to an individuality that was, in the grand cosmic scale of this entity's existence, so utterly insignificant? The storm outside raged, mirroring the final chaotic surrender within me. Yes, the voice whispered, its tone now gentle, almost tender, like a lover's caress. That's it, little instrument. Let go. Cease your struggle. Join the song. There is such peace in the silence, in the resonance. No more pain, Livia. No more fear. Only us. The green light from the resonance chamber's heart pulsed warmly, invitingly, promising an end to my torment, emerging into its vast, timeless consciousness. My eyelids grew heavy. My thoughts, once so frantic, so desperate, began to slow, to quiet, to dissolve into the swirling chorus of voices that now felt less like an assault and more like a welcoming embrace. I was so tired, so very tired of fighting, of being afraid. Perhaps this was peace. Perhaps this was the solace that Brooksville, in its many forms, always offered in the end. To become an echo, a note in an eternal, sorrowful song. The image of the locket from the other story, the one that had shown me. The hands planting a sapling flickered in my mind. No, that was a different story, a different terror. My mind was fragmenting, other narratives bleeding through. Here, there was no locket of hope, only the cold, humming machinery and the all-consuming voice. I was at my lowest point, my will eroded, my identity dissolving like mist in the encroaching, luminous green fog. Just as the last vestiges of myself, my I, began to fray, to surrender to the overwhelming chorus, a single, unexpected sound cut through the psychic din. It wasn't a whisper, not a voice from the entity. It was a sharp, clear, almost painfully pure electronic tone, a perfect sine wave, emanating not from the ancient equipment in the chamber, but seemingly from within my own memory of the station's most advanced, most precisely calibrated broadcasting gear upstairs. It was a sound I knew intimately, the sound of a perfectly tuned oscillator, the foundational hum of a clean, uncorrupted signal, the very antithesis of the chaotic, multi-layered static that the entity inhabited. For an instant, the chorus of whispers faltered, a wave of pure, undiluted confusion, almost like pain, rippling through the voice. The green light flickered violently. That pure tone, a forgotten fragment of my technical knowledge, a symbol of order amidst chaos, had, for a breathtaking moment, caused the entity to recoil. A tiny, almost extinguished ember of defiance, of hope, flared within me. A pure signal. A counterfrequency. The entity fed on emotional resonance, on psychic noise, on the cacophony of sorrow and fear. But what if a signal of pure, unadulterated order, a wave of perfect, unwavering clarity, could disrupt its hold, could silence its chorus? The thought, a desperate last-ditch gamble, was a sliver of light in the overwhelming darkness. That infinitesimally small flicker of an idea, a pure, ordered signal against the entity's chaotic chorus, was all I had left. The voice still swirled in my mind, a maelstrom of ancient sorrows and predatory intent. But that memory of a clean sine wave, a perfect unwavering tone, was a tiny island of clarity in the overwhelming psychic storm. The resonance chamber pulsed with its sickly green light, the storm outside a symphony of impending doom. But a desperate, almost reckless plan began to form. The entity thrived on noise, on emotional resonance, on the messy, chaotic frequencies of human despair and fear. It used the station's infrastructure, designed to capture and amplify sound, as its own personal instrument of torment. But what if I could create a signal so pure, so devoid of emotional content, so antithetical to its very nature, that it would disrupt the conduit, perhaps even silence the voice itself? It was a sound technician's desperate gamble, a leap of faith into the esoteric principles of my own craft. I had to reach the main control room, to the station's most powerful transmitter, the one capable of broadcasting across the entire city, across the region. It was several floors above, a perilous journey through the storm-racked, entity-infested station. The voice in my mind sensed my shift in intent, its tone morphing from seductive persuasion to a furious, outraged roar. You cannot silence the city's heart, little instrument. You are ours. The ascent from the sub-basement was a living nightmare. The corridors, plunged into absolute darkness by the complete power failure, were now alive with tangible, shadowy forms that clawed at me. Their touch icy cold, their whispers a cacophony of threats and despairing pleas. Illusions flickered at the edge of my vision. Familiar faces contorted in agony. Loved ones beckoning me into shadowy doorways that I knew led only to oblivion. The building itself seemed to fight me, stairs shifting like Escher drawings, doors refusing to open. But the memory of that pure tone and the image of Dr. Thorne's and Penwright's consumed fates fueled my desperate flight. I navigated by touch, by a grim familiarity with the station's layout. The heavy flashlight I'd taken earlier, now my only guide, its beam cutting a swathe through the oppressive, writhing darkness. The entity threw everything it had at me, auditory assaults that made my ears bleed, waves of psychic terror that threatened to buckle my knees. But I clung to the fragile shield of my desperate idea. Reaching the main control room, I found it in chaos. Emergency power had failed here too. Consoles were dark, screens blank. Only the raging storm outside, visible through the tall studio windows, illuminated the room in stark, intermittent flashes of lightning. And the voice was here, stronger than ever, a deafening, multi-layered chorus of triumph and menace, assured of its victory. Nowhere to run, little listener. Nowhere to hide. Join the song. No, I gasped, fumbling for the manual override switches on the main transmitter console, my fingers slick with cold sweat. I will not be your instrument. I had to reroute power from the station's emergency batteries, a complex, risky procedure even without a psychic entity screaming in my mind. The schematics, the technical knowledge I had spent years acquiring, became my only anchor, my only weapon. As I worked, the shadows in the control room deepened, coalesced, taking on more defined, monstrous forms. They pressed in around me, their icy breath on my neck, their whispers trying to break my concentration, to induce that final, fatal surrender. But the image of the pure sine wave, the memory of its brief, disruptive effect on the entity, burned bright in my mind. A single point of focus in the overwhelming chaos. I found the controls for the primary broadcast oscillator, the heart of the station's signal generation. My plan was audacious, perhaps insane, to bypass all modulation, all input, and generate a single, pure, unwavering frequency at maximum power, a frequency devoid of information, of emotion, of anything the entity could feed upon or corrupt. A signal of absolute sterile order against its cacophony of chaos. With trembling hands, I began to adjust the ancient heavy dials, ignoring the entity's furious, deafening roars in my mind, its shadowy tendrils now physically buffeting the equipment around me. Sparks flew from overloaded circuits. The air crackled with an almost unbearable tension. The entire control room seemed to vibrate, to groan under the strain of the conflicting energies, the storm outside reaching a new apocalyptic crescendo. "You cannot!" the voice shrieked, a sound of pure, dawning panic. "You will destroy us all. You will destroy yourself." But I knew this was its fear speaking, its fear of silence, of order, of a purity it could not comprehend, could not consume. I pushed the main amplification to its absolute limit, the needles on the old VU meters slamming into the red. For a heart-stopping moment, the two forces, the entity's chaotic, multi-layered static, and my single, pure, unwavering tone, seemed to battle for dominance. The control room was filled with a blinding, strobing light, a deafening, tearing sound that felt like reality itself was being ripped apart. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for annihilation, for the final, inevitable descent into madness or oblivion. Then, with a sound like a colossal exhaled breath, a sound that seemed to shake the entire city of Oakhaven, it happened. The pure tone, amplified to an impossible degree, reached a point of critical resonance. There was a single earth-shattering crack, a flash of pure white light that seared through my closed eyelids. And then, silence. An absolute, profound, and utterly empty silence. The storm outside ceased abruptly, the wind dying, the rain stopping as if a celestial tap had been turned off. The oppressive weight in my mind, the chorus of whispers, the terrifying presence of the voice, all gone. The only sound in the control room was the frantic, ragged gasping of my own breath, and the gentle, rhythmic ticking of the emergency clock, its power somehow miraculously restored. Cautiously, I opened my eyes. The control room was a wreck. Consoles were scorched, monitors shattered, yet the single pure tone I had generated still hummed faintly from a small, undamaged auxiliary speaker, a testament to its victory. The sickly green glow from the sub-basement, which had been a faint, ominous presence even up here, was extinguished. The air felt clean, light, breathable for the first time in what felt like an eternity. Had I done it? Had I actually silenced the echoes? Severed the conduit? Or was this merely a temporary reprieve? A lull before an even greater storm? I didn't know. But as I looked out of the studio window, the first fragile fingers of a pale, watery dawn were beginning to touch the ravaged Oakhaven skyline, the city lights below no longer appearing as watchful, malevolent eyes, but as simple, ordinary beacons of human habitation. Exhaustion, more profound than any I had ever known, washed over me. I stumbled from the control room, out into the silent, debris-strewn corridors of the station. There were no shadows, no whispers, only the quiet hum of the emergency power and the distant, comforting sounds of a city slowly awakening to a new, storm-cleansed day. The reign of the static, it seemed, was over. Yet, as I finally emerged from the grand Gothic archway of the Oakhaven Metropolitan radio station into the cool, damp air of the new morning, I knew I would never be the same. I had journeyed into the heart of an ancient urban darkness, confronted its voice, and somehow, against all odds, found a way to broadcast silence. The city seemed brighter, its sounds sharper, yet beneath it all, I would forever listen for the faintest, most subtle echo in the static. The knowledge of what lay hidden beneath the city's mundane facade, of the thin veil between realities, was a burden I would always carry. The station, I suspected, would never truly be free of its past, its potential as a conduit perhaps only dormant, waiting for another storm, another unwary listener. But for now, there was silence, a fragile, precious, and hard-won silence. And in that silence, for the first time in a very long time, I could hear the sound of my own, solitary, surviving heartbeat. The storm has passed. The city breathes anew, its myriad lights a softer, distant gleam. The station sleeps beneath a sky of blue, awakened from its long and troubled dream. No voices ride the static's ragged edge. No shadows dance where only truth should be. I stand upon a silent, hard-won ledge, the warden of a fragile frequency. The ancient hum within these walls has changed. The old equipment, scarred but standing tall, no longer sings of sorrows prearranged, nor answers to the darkness spectral call. The sub-basement lies quiet, cold, and deep, its gateway sealed by will and by the light of one pure tone, roused from its haunted sleep that pushed the endless chorus from the night. My shift continues, though the dread has waned, replaced by knowledge, heavy and profound, of unseen currents, terribly unchained, and silence that's more than an absence of sound. I listen still, to every crackle, sigh, the city's breath upon the airwaves borne, but now my own clear signal is my reply, a quiet strength to meet the coming morn, for in the static, echoes still may drift, a whisper of the vastness that resides beyond our knowing, a forgotten gift or ancient hunger on ethereal tides. But I am here, a guardian of the band, where my own reasoned frequency holds sway, a sound technician with a steady hand who met the darkness and then found the day.